Okay, this is part 2, or second and final part about Mechalyah Lishvach and Siman Tzadivov, the beginning of Siman Tzadivov. So we've spoken about all kinds of cases with Mechalyah Lishvach, where a Davar Charif draws tam out of a kli that's Eina Ben Yomer, and even though it's Eina Ben Yomer, the tam gets made positive again to the point that it can make the Davar Charif aser. So Mechalyah Lishvach. All the cases that we spoke about were cases like that, where it was a Eina Ben Yomer kli, and now the Davar Charif is in Mechalyah Lishvach. But that Eina Ben Yomer kli is one type of nice tam of gam, but there's another type of nice tam of gam, and that is when there's a kosher food, not a Blios, food that can't affect another food because it's nice tam of gam. Well, for example, I'm making up a case. Let's say we say that meat that mixed into coffee makes a negative taste in the coffee. I have no idea. We'll just pretend that that's what it is. So then, if treif meat would fall into a cup of coffee, then once we pull the meat out, the coffee would be mutter. Even though it has a blia of meat in it, the meat is lefkam, in our case, the meat is lefkam into coffee, and therefore it can't make the coffee treif. So as long as we get the piece of meat out, we could drink the coffee. We don't have to worry about blias. So would Mechalyah Lishvach work in that kind of a case also? Can it take the blia, which is the tam that's coming out, which is lefkam, and make it better, make it positive, that it should make the food aser, even though if it would have been into not Davar Charif, it would have not been. Would it work in that kind of case? So, turns out that Tosfos says that this case is mamish talked about in the Gemara, according to Tosfos. Now, it's not the Gemara we're used to. The Gemara we know in Avodah Zarah about Mechalyah Lishvach and Daf Lamed Tesamanal, about Cheltis. Tosfos says, if you look on Tosfos in Daf Samach Tesamanal, says that the Gemara actually talks about this case. The Gemara talks about if you have a rodent, an achbar, if you have an achbar and it fell into vinegar, the Gemara has a question: does that make the vinegar aser or does it not make it aser? So Tosfos learns that the Gemara is assuming that the tam of an achbar into vinegar, the tam of an achbar into other foods is lefkam. That was a question in the Gemara earlier, but it's making an assumption that it's nice tam lefkam. So why should it maybe aser? What would be aser about it? If it's nice tam lefkam, it should be mutter. The reason is because since it's going into vinegar, and vinegar is charif, so it's Mechalyah Lishvach. And it takes the tam lefkam that would have come out of this achbar, and it makes it lishvach. Now that's going into a Davar Charif. Now that's going into into Davar Charif. Okay. So now the Gemara has the tzad that it is that's I just explained the reason, the way Tosfos explains what the reason is why the vinegar should be aser. The reason why it should be mutter is not the opposite. The reason why aser is a different reason why. It's not because we think it's not Mechalyah Lishvach. According to Tosfos, both Stogim and the Gemara assume that Mechalyah Lishvach works even if it's for foods. Just like it works for Eina Ben Yomer from a kli, that kind of it works here also. Now, what Tosfos says, it fits very well with how we explained last time. We explained last time from Aruch and Mishkas Yaakov. How does Mechalyah Lishvach work? What is that? What is the mechanics of how that works? And we said that the way it works is that anything that's charif inherently has a something negative about it. There's an automatic negativity, which is the charifus of it, the sharpness, the acerbic nature of this food is something that's not so desirable. There are other parts that are good. Overall, it's a good food, but there's a little bit. The sharpness takes a little bit away from it. So by mixing in some food, it's any other food basically that you mix into it that's not charif itself, any other food that you mix into it will mellow that and make it take away from that the strength of that charifus, and that's overall that's positive. So the thing that's being mixed in, the Eina Ben Yomer tam, the next tam, a tam that would theoretically be next tam of gam, here serves a positive purpose. So its overall role is lishvach and cause something positive. Now that line of reason, which said from Aruch and Mishkas Yaakov, maybe in the Chazon Ish and Rambam, that logic for how it works just as good if it's coming out of an achbar as if it's coming from Eina Ben Yomer. The point is, it doesn't make a difference what the treif food, it doesn't make a difference if it's a blia or it's a blia coming out of an actual food. The point is, in fact, it's giving, in a certain sense, it's giving a negative taste. But the fact that this is a Davar Charif, then the negative taste serves a role, and overall is good, and that's considered Mechalyah Lishvach. So according to Tosis, we're good. We understand that according to Tosis, it's seemingly it's a Beferish Gemara according to Tosis that Mechalyah Lishvach works for foods that are less Talmud Gam, just like for Blios that are less Talmud Gam, and it fits well with the logic that we explained for how less Talmud Gam works last time. However, that's what Tosis says. But Rashi has a different shot in the Gemara. That according to Rashi, the Gemara has nothing to do at all with, well, it doesn't anything to do with whether you say Mechalyah Lishvach, nothing to do at all. And the Chassam Sofer says that the reason why Rashi doesn't hold like Tosis is exactly for this point, because Rashi says it's not possible that Mechalyah Lishvach should work for actual foods. It only works for Blios. There's no such thing as Mechalyah Lishvach for actual food. So that can't possibly be in the Gemara. So Rashi therefore has to say a different shot. Whatever Rashi tries not relevant to us. Rashi had to say a whole different shot in the Gemara. Because to him it was pashut that Mechalyah Lishvach only works for Blios that are nice Talmud Gam, but not for foods that are nice Talmud Gam. Now, there's a number of other Achronim, excuse me, who are not talking about Rashi and Tosis, but they also, to them, they say it's also obvious that Mechalyah Lishvach does not apply to actual foods. And it starts, that these Achronim start from Teres Chatos, that's Ramah, who talks about, the Taz brings in Nar Simon, that the Ramah says like this: if a person cut a radish, davacharf, and he found that when he was cutting it, there was a worm in the radish also. Okay, so that worm's treif, of course. So he has to clean off his knife. He has to clean off the radish, the place where he was cutting it, because there might be the end left of worm on that spot. Okay, that's not so important to us. But doesn't have to be worried about Blios of the worm going into the radish, even though it was cut and it was a double charv, because it's nice Talmud Gam. He doesn't worry about it because it's nice Talmud Gam. So the Mechalyah on the spot says, wait a second, but it's a double charv. Double charv is the Mechalyah Lishvach. He says that shows you that the Rama needs to say is that Mechalyah Lishvach doesn't work for actual foods that are nice Talmud Gam. In other words, for Blios that are nice Talmud Gam. And he says, and Mechalyah says, and go look at the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, in Nachsamates, and you'll see that it says like that also. And the Pri Megadim explains what I just said. He doesn't say that it's only if you cheat this Rashi. For some reason, they're not mentioning that Tosis says not like that. But the way you read according to Rashi, you see in that Gemara that Talmud Gam Mechalyah Lishvach wasn't on the radar as a reason. Right now, then on the Mechalyah, in the back of the regular Mechalyahs, there's ha'aros from Rabbi Kiva. Not very many, but one of his ha'aros is on this, and he says, go look at the Tshuva in Shev Yaakov, Siman Lam Gimel. Okay, excuse me. And he says, and in Shev Yaakov, he's not talking about this kind of a question. He's not talking about our din, but he says to him it's pashut that Mechalyah Lishvach only works for Blios and does not work for Blios that are Eina ben Yomer, but it does not work for actual ben. Okay. Now, some of these Achronim that I just mentioned, and the Mechalyah and the Pri Megadim, the Chassam Sofer, give words that give that a little bit of a hint as to why they think what should be the difference. Why should Mechalyah Lishvach only work for Blios and not for if it comes from an actual achbar or in this case a worm or something like that? They give hints to it. But the Shev Yaakov explains it the most clearly. I think that they all mean the same thing. They all use similar little words that hint at, when they say the way they think the din is, they use words that give hint like this. So the Shev Yaakov gives more of an explanation. I'm going to explain the Shev Yaakov using my own phrases. I believe this is what he means. He doesn't use exactly the words I'm going to use, but give or take, this is what I think he's saying. And in fact, what I think everyone is saying. He says, when Tom becomes Eina ben Yomer. So let's say tray food was a knife was used on tray food. Excuse me. So there's a bli of tray food in the knife. A bli of tray food in the knife. And now if it sits there, it becomes nice Talmud Gam. We say it's Eina ben Yomer and it becomes nice Talmud Gam. So what's going on really is that the taste of the treif meat is still Lishvach. It still would give a positive taste into other foods. But on top of that, there's a layer added onto it of the metal of the being inside the kli or something about it. That there's a layer on top of it that causes the overall taste to be negative. That is to say, there's a base of the taste which is which would be Lishvach, it would be positive. It's a nice piece of meat. It should taste good. But something's been added on top of it. It's been covered. It's been layered with something else that makes it have negative taste. Now, we saw way back when we first started learning about double charf some time ago, we saw that a double charf has this property that it draws tam out of places that regular things can't go. Remember, all the other din of double charf, all the other properties that there are about double charf, about working for a klisheni, and they work, it gets past not far not, and it works even when there's no heat. We saw that all the things about, except for this, Mechalyah, all the other details of double charf are that they draw tam in ways that regular otherwise wouldn't get out. They get deeper in and more complete tam that otherwise wouldn't come out. So what he's saying is that over here, there's good tam in the kli. The good tam is just covered over. It has this layer on top of it of pagam that came from sitting there for 24 hours. So the double charf is able to touch in and tap into the actual tam. It gets to the real tam deeper in, and then pull that out. So the way the double charf is Mechalyah Lishvach is by drawing us out the real tam without the coatings that are on top of it that are ruining it. Just the actual tam itself, and that tam itself is of course Lishvach. That tam was a nice piece of meat. There's nothing bad about it at all, and it's managed to tap into that without the layer that's on top of it. Now, if that's the way Mechalyah Lishvach works, then that only makes sense when we're talking about something that the inherent tam that's in there is good. It's just been covered with something that's no good. That's fine for a Blios that became in the Binyamri. But what happens if we have something that's discussing like the worm that the Ramah spoke about? Or what happens if we have something that's spoiled? That was the case of the Shev Yaakov. His case was something that's spoiled. So then the thing itself is rotten. The thing itself has a negative taste. Either the worm, because worms don't taste good, or because the food that's spoiled, the whole food has now become ruined. The whole food has become something that has a negative taste. It doesn't have a layer on top of it. It in itself has a negative taste. So the double charf can't do anything. The double charf, what's it going to go? It's going to dig in and what? There's no real tam in there. The tam of the worm or the tam of the spoiled food is just as disgusting as everything else. There's nothing better and worse about it. It's not like a layers of different things. And therefore, there's no way for it to be Mechalyah Lishvach. It couldn't possibly be. There's no way for Mechalyah Lishvach to work on a food that inherently has a negative taste to that. Okay, just as an aside, just as an aside, according to this Hezber, which again I think that the others, the Mechalyah is where he says something that's ba'atzmai pogum mitchilasay olam hu b'tchilasay b'yasay olam, or he says some sort says it's saruach pogum be'en, or Prim Gam says it's pogum meikaray. These are things that are like they're like so. The inherently trade, that's where Mechalyah Lishvach doesn't work. All these cases we're talking about, all these things are for things that are be'etzem negative. In the case that I spoke about way back at the beginning today, about a piece of meat falling into coffee, or for a piece of meat falling into some other kind of double charf, where the be'etzem it's a good tasting food, then seemingly they would agree that you could say Mechalyah Lishvach. We're only not saying Mechalyah Lishvach. Okay, but when it's actually like a rat. So what we're seeing here is, okay, let's summarize. What we saw here is that Tosfos and the Ra'ah have one way of explaining Mechalyah Lishvach, and according to the way they understand how Mechalyah Lishvach works, it works just as well for all types of nice tam rafkam. It works whether it's a Blios that's in a Binyamri, or it's a rat, or if it's a worm, it's all the same thing. It can always be Mechalyah Lishvach. And we're seeing now an alternate explanation of how Mechalyah Lishvach, and that works from a number of these achronim. That works well with the way Rashi learned the Gemara, who said that Mechalyah Lishvach only works for Ein Binyamri Blios. It works for that, but it does not work for things that are inherently have a bad taste. And again, as I mentioned, all these names of who said this, it seems like the later poskim seem to have the consensus is to follow this and to say Mechalyah Lishvach does not work when we have a food that's inherently not true. So this is basically it's a kula. It's saying is that you cannot say Mechalyah Lishvach in those kind of cases. Okay, and just that's our summary for that. And just what you're hearing between the lines. But listen to all these people who are talking about this. Just about everyone who we mentioned today is all making an assumption that vinegar is a double charf and could be in the rules of Mechalyah Lishvach. And last time we mentioned that the Chazon Ish says not like that. So again, all these people are saying not with the Chazon Ish. So again, last time we had also a nice lineup of people who said not with the Chazon Ish, that vinegar is considered charav l'inyan, the rules of Mechalyah Lishvach. Okay, now let's move on to a different question related to Mechalyah Lishvach. That is like this. The Ramah says that if you have ginger, it's a double charav, but you can buy ginger that from Goyim, it's cut. Meaning it's not a solid piece. It's a cut piece of ginger, because they have kelim yuchadim. They have special tools that they use for cutting it off the ground when they harvest it. And those kelim are not used for anything treif. So you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about that. Maybe they use the knife for something treif. So that's fine. That's one did. If we have a reason to believe that they have kelim yuchadim, then you don't have to worry about that the knife might have been treif. Okay, one. Then the Shach says, what about the opposite? What happens if we know somebody used a knife, a regular knife, to cut something to a charav, but the knife is ein ben yomer, so we say the food is treif, because we have to assume that one time in the past the guy must have used that knife for something treif, in which it had a bli of something treif, and so even though it's ein ben yomer, we say Mechalyah Lishvach, even though it's not chiltus, so then it's treif. Okay, so we have two opposite extremes. We have one case where we assume the guy used this knife only for kosher. We have one case where we assume the guy probably wants to use it for treif. Okay, it's a regular knife. He probably uses it for treif. So what happens if we're not sure. Okay, we're not sure whether they have kelim yuchadim, they have special kelim, or they use a regular knife. Okay, so we're not sure what happens if we're in the middle here. We don't know, is this a regular knife or these people have kelim yuchadim? So the answer to this comes from the Ramah in Halacha Aleph, in Tzadi Bav Halacha Aleph, who says seemingly it could be mekel. And the Shach explains that we have a rule that stam ken ne'v'nirman. So that means that anytime this shayla that we're dealing with is a shayla of just a Mechalyah Lishvach. Okay, it's not a question that was ben. We assume it's ein ben yamin. Now there are Rishonim who say that Mechalyah Lishvach is only an issue for a chiltus, maybe chiltus and tznoim. So we have essentially a safek if the knife was ever used for treif, because maybe this is a knife that they're using kelim yuchadim, and safek even if it was used for treif, well, it's ein ben yomer, so it's a safek whether maybe Mechalyah Lishvach doesn't apply to things that are not chiltus, and therefore we could be mekel. So it's basically a safek. Okay, so now we just heard an explanation for what happens when you're mesupik. If it's kelim yuchadim or they use a regular knife, then we say, based on a safek, we say safek. The Ramah says if it's safek, then it's mutter. Okay, well, we have a question on that. The Mechaber says that if you have lemon juice or salted fish, and the going to deliver them in bulk, okay, big barrels full of them, lots and lots of pieces, you're allowed to eat them. So of course, what's the chashash? The chashash is maybe they cut those lemons or they slice the fish with a treif knife and they're Mechalyah Lishvach. That's the thing to be concerned about over here. That's the potential thing to be concerned about. So the Mechaber says that it's mutter. The Ramah says, why is it mutter? He says the reason why it's mutter is because since they're coming in bulk, you're getting a lot of lemon juice, or a barrel full of lemon juice, or of cut up fish, salted fish, which is double charav. So therefore, even if there are some that were cut, even if they were cut with a treif knife, there are only a few of them that would actually be treif. There's only that much bleed to go around. So the treif ones are bottled in the kosher ones, and that's where you're allowed to eat them. So the question is, wait a second. It's a safek. We don't know if they use kelim yuchadim or if they use knives that we use for other things beforehand. So it's a safek. So didn't I just tell you that the Ramah says that when you mesupik, whether it's kelim yuchadim or not, then you're allowed to use them. We say safek, and you're allowed to use it. You're allowed to eat it. So why did Ramah have to say over here that it's mutter because of bitul? Because even if they're treif, they're going to be bottled. Why didn't he say it? He said in halacha aleph that there's a safek you could be mekel. So why over here? We're in halacha vav, and halacha daled. So why over here did he forget about this safek that you're allowed to be mekel? So the Shach answers this question. And the Shach says that the difference is because the Ramah's only mekel. The case where the Ramah was mekel on halacha aleph without safek was a case where it was cooking with radishes. That the question was how did they cut the radishes off the ground? And he says in that case it's a reasonable possibility that they use a shovel, a marav v'chatzina. meaning that they get them out of the ground with something that would never be used for treif. It's a shovel. The shovel is used just for digging food out of the, root vegetables out of the ground or whatever, and digging up in your backyard. They would never be used for treif. So that's the case when the Ramah say that there's a real safek that maybe they use kalim that are miyuchadim. That's a good chance. There's a good chance that they just dig it out with a shovel, and it's just kalim miyuchadim. That's the case where we let it make a safek. But if you have something that was cut with a knife, so then you say, come on, the knife once must have been used for treif. The guy has just a knife, he must use it once for treif. And if you had even one time that you used it for treif, 6 weeks ago, that would have been enough because of Mechalyah Lishvach. So therefore, the chance that this is a dedicated knife is so small that basically for these purposes, that's not enough to make it a safek. So the only time we make about a safek, only case where Amos says that safek is mutter is when there's a reasonable safek. It's a nice chance that they use a marov chatzina. It's a case with a good chance that they dug it up with something that taka is killing. We call them. That's when we have a safek. But when we basically assume the guy used a regular knife, then the possibility maybe they use kalim yuchadim. That's not enough. That's not enough for us to be makel based on that. Okay, so now let's see if we could apply these rules that we just heard to some cases. So let's say we get something from an industrial factory. I don't know, we get cut up lemons or ground spices or some other double charif that was, processed and ground or cut, etc. like that. So in that case, there's a very good possibility that they use kalim yuchadim. That they use kalim, the equipment that they use is only used for kosher food. I mean, that's pretty typical. That there is a chance, it's possible that they use the machinery to cut up treif meat, and maybe, in ways that would make the grinders and the cutters and the knives treif. It's possible. But in this case, it's very much like the radish case I just mentioned. There's a very good chance that it's marva chatzina, that they're using kalim it's a very good chance that they're using kalim that are special for this. So that is enough. That's the case what the Rambam says is, if it's a safek, then you can be simon and say, safek, and therefore you're allowed to eat the food and you would be allowed to eat these spices or other double charv made in the factory. Okay, that's fine for a factory. But what happens if it's a food service? So you in a restaurant, you go to a restaurant, or you're sitting in a hotel lobby, and they give you a drink or they give you a Pepsi, and it has a slice of lemon inside of it. Okay, so the question is, was that lemon? What should we think of that lemon was cut with a knife that had been used for treif beforehand? So over here, it's possible that it was a marva chatzina, but here the chances are much stronger that it was used in treif. It's a treif restaurant. There's lots of treif food around. It's not like a factory that it's really unlikely that they have the same equipment used for spices as is for meat. Here it's a very likely possibility. So what would the Rambam make on this case? So on the one hand, let's look like there's a reason that we should make them. In many restaurants, the fruits and vegetables and things like that are cut in a special area. And as they have kalim yuchadim, that target is or a case like that. It's not exact. It's not like the ginger case where we were assuming that they have kalim yuchadim. No, but maybe it's enough like the radish case that it's a reasonable possibility that there's kalim yuchadim. Maybe. And then another thing is that let's say they use a treif knife. So we keep saying here that if they ever use a knife for treif, then we're finished. If you use a knife for treif, then you're stuck that the food is going to be treif forever because of Mechalyah Lishvach. Well, that's forgetting that when we spoke about double charif and duchel the sakina, we found out that there's a way to take a knife that's treif and get rid of the blios. So the official way, if you open up your Shulchan Aruch, is to do neitza. Now that's not so likely that anybody did neitza, but we also heard that if you wash it with soap and water, that's also going to get it clean. And so that is a very real possibility. I don't know if you wash it every time with soap and water, so overall with chayshish, but all of a sudden we're only being chayshish for Blios that happened in the past little bit. They don't. Let's say once a day. Do they wash their knives with soap and water? They don't sit around forever. So in Shulchan Aruch's time, a knife that was used for treif 2 weeks ago would still have a problem because the Blios that are in there are we can still say Mechalyah Lishvach. But excuse me. But when we're talking about Blios that are that could be taken care of by washing with soap and water, then all of a sudden we have a very different story. Okay, but on the other hand, go to the other side is that one of the ways that they're going to wash it with soap and water is by putting it to a dishwasher. Whoa! If we do that, then not only we might be getting rid of some Blios, that's true, and some residue that's on the surface, but we're ruining it because we're making it treif in the dishwasher. We saw it way back when we talked about dishwashers, also in an earlier halacha, that's a way to make it actually treif. Okay, so we have different studim over here. So, but what we're forgetting is, so maybe from this side of safek is not going to be enough to make it with the frost. But you have to remember is, the Ramos said, what was the Ramos din? What did he say, why you let eat the lemons? He said you let eat the lemons. Remember, he had a different reason. It wasn't, in that case, wasn't based on something. He said it is because it's cut, enough pieces are cut at a time, that's going to be bottle, that's going to be bottle. That is to say is, and that's basically what's going to go on in the restaurant. It could be that they cut one slice of lemon to put into your drink. But it's not so likely. Really, more likely is they cut up lots of lemons at the beginning of the day to put into everybody's drinks. In which case, what the Ramos said is going to apply, which is there's only this many slices that could be treif, and those amount of slices that we have that could be treif. We'll talk about this in Rich Hashem one day in Simon Kuftes about Yavish B'Yavish. The one or the ones that are treif are going to be bottle, and the ones that are not treif. So similarly, that's a reason why a person would be allowed to eat this, even if it's double charv, even in like a restaurant type setting. Now, before we wind down on Mechalyah Lishvach, I just want to mention the din, which is sort of an opposite in the way of this din, and that is like this. We're talking this whole time about how double charv has a special ability to take time, which is Ein Ben Yomer, and make it Lishvach. Okay, so what's going on here is that the kli is treif. It's been treif for more than 24 hours. But because of the kosher food that's here, like the charif kosher food can do something to make it that the Ein Ben Yomer goes from being lefkam to being lishvach. It makes it at the negative treif becomes a positive treif and causes the food to be treif. Now, there's a case where the opposite is true, where it's not that the kosher charif makes a difference, but it's the treif that makes a difference. That is to say, if the tam that was below in the kli was wine or whiskey, then that tam does not become effective when it becomes Ein Ben Yomer. So even though it's been in the kli for more than 24 hours, it remains lishvach. So there, it's not because of the food that it's going into that makes it lishvach, but it's the food, the way that what's coming out that is lishvach. It never becomes Ein Ben Yomer. So there's like sort of an opposite way that a thing should not become Ein Ben Yomer. In Rich Hashem, we're going to talk about that when we get to, hopefully in Simon Kuf Gimel, about Ein Ben Yomer. Now, just to end off, we've been talking about Ducha de Sakin and Mechalyah Lishvach quite a number of times. And what I want to do now is I want to go through, with your patience, 15 cases that are reasonably common or common questions about double charif, or about not double charif, about cutting, things like that, cutting knives and charif and things like that. And I'm just going to, each one of them, just give a brief question and answer with a brief explanation, not too much detail. It's all based on things that we've said until now, just sort of like a summary for the past number of times. Okay, what I'm going to say, you should assume in all these cases that everything is kosher and parav and ambient, unless I tell you otherwise. Okay, no, that's what you should assume. Second, you should assume is if I say something is milchigs or fleishigs or treif, that means it's been used that way within the past 24 hours. Again, unless I tell you otherwise. Okay, and the knives are assumed to have never had any eatza or washing with soap and things like that since whenever it is that they became fleishigs or treif or like that. Okay, those are our assumptions. Okay, so first is I'm going to get, what are some examples of a double charif? So we had the salted fish. They're in alphabetical order, at least on my paper. Garlic, grapefruit, herring, salted herring, horseradish, jalapeno peppers, leeks, lemons, limes, olives, onions, peppercorns, pickles, radishes, salt, scallion, vinegar, and whiskey. Okay, I don't know, that's quite like, I don't know, 15, 20 cases. Okay. Now, here's a question. If something was not charif, was cut with a fleshig knife, can you eat that food with nuchas? So, like a regular vegetable that was not charif, could you eat it with nuchas? And the answer is yes, you could eat it with nuchas if you clean off the place where it was cut. Okay? It's ducha de sakina. So this ducha de sakina leaves grease on the knife, which transfers onto the food, and you have to clean it in order to get that off. And the way you clean it depends on what the food is that you cut, the not charif food. So you do hadacha, which is to rinse it off if it's something hard like a carrot. You do greira, which is like a scraping, if it's something soft like a cooked potato. You do klipa, which is to cut off a layer, if it's for a hot food, and it was cut with a knife that was fleishigs, but was Ein Ben Yomer from being fleishigs. and you do shift of gadol, which is if you scrub it under running water, if it's something soft like meat or fish, where greira and klipa is not possible. Okay, number 3. Can I purchase watermelon or carrots from a supermarket which is not without hashgacha? So those are not, the answer is, those are not charv, and they may have been cut with a knife that once been used for shape, but the answer is yes, you're allowed to, because they probably use a knife that's kelim yuchad, that's just for fruits and vegetables in a supermarket, that's common, and even if they didn't, then the ones that are treif would be batel, the slices that are treif would be batel and the ones that are kosher. Okay, number 4, can you buy raw frozen salmon fillets from frozen ones from a store like, I don't know, Sam's Club, that has no ingredients in it, just cut up fish and has no hashgacha? And the answer for that is yes. The salmon is not charv. The fish, people who cut fish, again, cut hundreds of pieces of fish at a time. So that means is even if one of the pieces happened to have been, the knife had been not kosher, had been used as an shape beforehand, even that small possibility that they hadn't cleaned it well beforehand, they hadn't washed it with soap and water, even so it would be bolted to the other pieces. Okay, and I use salmon as our example because salmon is a way you could buy a fish without scales on it, so you know you're getting a kosher fish, as I'm going to mention in a second. Okay, now what about others? Let's say you want to buy sliced fish, raw fish from a fish store, not a kosher fish store. So the first thing, of course, the last case I tell you was salmon. So in salmon, you know just by looking at the flesh that's a kosher fish. So the first thing is you're going to have to check that it has scales that you could pull off without ripping the skin. That's first, just like it's a kosher fish. So then we have a problem, because the knife that he's using in the fish store, he might not have cut so many pieces before he cut this. He might have cut treif and then cut this fish right afterwards, and it might be not so many pieces were cut. It's not like when you're buying in Sam's Club, it's coming from a factory that cut hundreds of pieces at a time. The fish store, they might cut one fish and then one type of fish and go right to the next kind of fish. So really, of course, the best thing is to go to a store with hashgacha. If there isn't, then you could ask them to cut the fish with your kosher knife. Bring your knife with you. And bring your own, tell them to put on a fresh piece of wax paper. That's easiest, because then you have no problems of Blios of the end switching onto your fish. Or you could have them wash their knife with soap and water, and then of course put onto a piece of paper. That's also. And the worst choice is if they won't use your knife or you clean their knife for you, then buy the piece of fish and take it home and do shifshuf or remove a ketei klipa. That's only b'diavad. The Rama says we're not allowed to count on buying something and count on doing klipa later on, because you might forget. But if b'diavad or a person is shas al, then they'd be allowed to do that. Okay, now the next case is what happens if there's a factory that's meant to they make smoked fish, and by mistake they brine the fish before they smoked it. They brine it, so it's in a very salty solution, in a kli that had been used for treif fish more than 24 hours beforehand, and they brine the kosher fish in that treif tank. So in that case is that the kosher fish would not be kosher, and the reason for that is because the salty fish is double harv, so it's Mechalyah Lishvach. The time that's in the container is Eina ben Yomer, but this is Mechalyah Lishvach. And therefore, it makes the entire kosher fish into a non-kosher fish. Okay. We talked about this, I believe. A person who has dentures can assume is allowed to eat charav on Pesach. There's some people who are not to. They're allowed to eat charav on Pesach. We assume that the dentures don't have any Blios in the first place, and therefore they don't have to worry about the town coming out with the double charav. Some people are not to, but most people assume that it's not a problem. Okay. Next, a person took a jar of pickles with all the juice. I may have mentioned this last time. I think that's when I mentioned it. And he stuck it he put it into a milk container, and he left it there for more than 24 hours. So those pickles cannot be used in a fleshik salad. The reason is because the pickles are charv. They are Mechalyah Lishvach. They draw time out of the container while they're covered for 24 hours, and even though the time is Eina ben Yomer, it's Mechalyah Lishvach, and therefore it makes the pickles to be fleshigs. To be milchigs, and therefore they cannot be put into a fleshik salad. If someone already put them into the fleshik salad, that would be totally in the shiloh of Beis Meir we spoke about last time, whether b'diavad to be makbid on that in this case because it's milchigs and fleshigs, and it's Eina ben Yomer, whether they should be makbid on that. Okay, another person. I'm up to my 9th of my 15 cases. He made a Caesar dressing, and he put in he put it into, he made a Caesar dressing. A Caesar dressing is not charav. I'm sorry, made a Caesar dressing, and he put it into a fleishig container and left it for 24 hours. Could he use that in a Greek salad? Greek salads have cheese on them. So can he put the Caesar dressing onto the Greek salad? And the answer is that since it takes 24 hours for the Blios to come out, it's Ein Ben Yomi, and it does not become fleishigs, and therefore he could put it onto his Greek salad. Now, the added detail here is that Caesar dressings, have vinegar in them. But the vinegar is just a minor ingredient. It's not the main overall taste over here. The way it says roiv, or it doesn't overall give a taste that's charav, and therefore Caesar dressing is not considered double charav, and therefore it's not Mechalyah Lishvach. So by the time the beer comes out, it's in the ben yermin, and it doesn't affect, cause it to become fleishigs. Okay. How about an onion was cut with a fleishig with a knife that was in the ben yermin for using for fleishigs? So that onion cannot be used in a soup that has cheese in it because it was Mechalyah Lishvach. As we've been talking, it's Mechalyah Lishvach, and it's the onion is now fleishig, and it cannot be put into a soup with cheese in it. The onion, of course, is harf. If they already did, that again backs to the Shiloh of the base mayor. Okay, next, a person sliced onions on a cutting board that was Ein Ben Yomi from fleishig use. The question is, can you put that onto a pizza? So in this case, it's Ein Ben Yomi, and the olives are, I said onion, I meant to say olives. Olives in most cases are considered to be a double charav, and we saw that the din of double charav applies, and ducha the sakin applies even on a cutting board also. It's not just the thing that a slice, the thing that you slice on is also, you could draw time from them also. So Bria comes out of the cutting board into the olives to make them fleishigs. The fact that it's Ein Ben Yomi doesn't make a difference because we say Mechalyah Lishvach. So those olives cannot be put onto a pizza. Okay. Now my 12th one is one I mentioned just a few minutes ago towards the end, which was if you're in a hotel lounge, there's a chafe hotel, and you give you a slice of lemon in your drink, you are allowed to use that lemon because the lemon is charav, and it would be Mechalyah Lishvach, but that's mitigated by the fact that it's a safek, that they might have special knives. The knives might have been cleaned with soap and water, and also likelihood is that they cut so many lemons, or enough lemons, that anyone that would become treif would be bitul in the ones that are kosher. Okay, now, a person, number 13, okay, someone made fried eggs with onions in an Ein Ben Yomi milchig pan. Okay, he sat down for breakfast, he put onions and eggs in and he fried them. And the spatula that he used was fleishigs. So what's the din of the pan and the spatula and the eggs? Okay, so the answer is like this. If the eggs were put into the pan before the onion, then everything's fine. Nothing's affected. And the reason for that is because if the eggs went in first, then the mixture of eggs and onion is not charav. It's mainly eggs. And therefore it's not charav. So therefore, nothing special happens over here. The pan is Ein Ben Yomi. The spatula is Ein Ben Yomi. Nothing affects each other. Everything is kosher, and everybody can go home happily. You can use the pan and the spatula, and the eggs are kosher. You can eat them, no problems. Okay. But the more typical case is not like that. The more typical case is that the onions were fried before the eggs were put in. So then it depends like this. If the spatula was used while the onions were still hard, means to say is the person was using the spatula before the onions fried very much and before the eggs were added. So if the spatula was used with a double charav, then the pan and the spatula have to be kosher and the eggs are treif. And why is that? That's because the charav onions are Mechalyah Lishvach, the milchig tam in the pan and the fleishig tam in the spatula. So the onions now become possible chalav, and therefore the onions are treif. The eggs mix into them, become treif also, and then the tam goes back into the pan and the spatula, and they also become treif. What happens if you only use the spatula when it was later in the process, when either the onions had already become not so charav, or the eggs were mixed in? Then the pan and the eggs are milchigs, or the pan started off milchigs, and the eggs are milchigs because they drew out tam out of the pan. They became milchig. That's fine. And the spatula should be kosher because the spatula now has a Blios from those milchig eggs and onions, and it should be kosher. The tam from the spatula does not affect the eggs and does not affect the pan because it's Ein Ben Yomi, so and it didn't have contact with the double charav. Okay, two more. Let's say someone cut onions with a fleishig knife and then he pureed them in a parva food processor. Then the food processor was used to parade other onions, and those onions had been cut with a paraffin knife. Everything was the Eina Binyamin, and all these things, everything was Eina Binyamin. So the question is, can you use the second onions with milchigs? So that is, these onions never got cut with a fleshig knife, but they were made in a food processor that had been previously used for onions that were cut with a fleshig knife. So we spoke about it a few times ago. It's a question. The Achronim, the Magen Avraham says you cannot, and many of the Achronim disagree and say that you can. Okay, and last is, a radish was cut with a fleshig knife, and you ate them. Okay, so now do you have to wait 6 hours before you eat milchigs afterwards? And what about the opposite case? What happens if you cut a radish with a milchig knife? Could you eat that right after fleshigs? And the answer to that is that in both of those cases, there's no need to wait 6 hours. The radish might be milchigs or fleshigs, but in the dinim of waiting for 6 hours, there is no need to wait 6 hours in either direction. After them, you could eat milchigs right away, or if you eat milchigs, you could eat the fleshig radish right away also.